Chapter 9. Lucy. Lucy slowly looked at each of the boys sitting in front of her in the classroom. She really hoped none of them were her secret admirer. Why wasn't he letting her know? How many weeks was he going to leave her wondering? She looked at the students sitting to her left. There was only one boy. Nope, she didn't want it to be him either. He talked with his mouth full and sprayed all those near him with food. So it better not be him. She also hoped it wasn't Cole. She'd caught him staring at her at lunch yesterday, and for a moment she'd thought he was actually going to walk towards her. Then Tanner had joined her and Cole had glared at her before he'd turned away. Hopefully he hadn't learned that Jasmine had been asking about him for her. It's Thursday, how long do you need to figure out what I can help you with? Lucy barely managed not to scream when Jack stopped beside her desk, cutting off her view of the boy she stared at. She started to tell him to go away, then remembered only she could see him. Instead she wrote the words "go away" at the top of the page on her schoolbook. Do you think I'm having a blast waiting for you to figure it out? Why do you have to be surrounded by those chicks all the time? And why have all of you got to spend half your time giggling? She underlined the words she'd written. Then drew a second line when he continued to stand there, tapping her pen lightly on the page beside the word. She considered asking to be excused to use the bathroom. It was frustrating not being able to argue with him. She didn't need his help. He was annoying her for no reason. Come and see me at lunch or I'll join you for the rest of your afternoon classes. She watched him stride across the room, walking through the wall. A glance around showed she was still the only one who could see him. She doubted the rest of her classmates would be sitting there calmly, some of them looking half asleep, if they'd seen Jack walk through a wall. Great. Just great. That made 2 crappy days in a row. Yesterday Dylan had been at her house again, full of questions about who was giving her a lift home. Today Jack was hassling her. She really hoped Dylan wasn't at her place this afternoon. Especially if Tanner dropped her home again. Yesterday afternoon she'd been tempted to ask Tanner if he'd been the one leaving her the rosebuds, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to raise the question. Not even when he'd sat with her at lunch yesterday. He'd asked her this morning if she'd join him for lunch today and she'd said yes. She couldn't be in 2 places at once. There was also no way she wanted to have Jack hassling her for the rest of the afternoon. She was likely to say something to him. Then everyone would think she was crazy and that she talked to people who didn't exist. That was all she needed. When the bell finally rang for lunch, she almost ran to the groundsman's shed. Jack was waiting for her. I thought you said you're meant to help, not hassle me. What you're doing is the complete opposite of help. She'd thought if she didn't bother calling him, he'd leave her alone. Then tell me how I can help. His voice was filled with exasperation. He had no reason to be exasperated. She was the only one who should be. There had to be some way to convince him to stop bothering her. I don't need help with anything. I'm fine. She started to turn away. Look, that blasted bird wouldn't have said you needed help if you didn't need any. I don't have time for this, Jack. I'm meant to be having lunch with Tanner. Maybe he's the problem. The angel said you needed my help just before you met him. Oh no you don't. I'm not going to let you ruin things between me and Tanner. She shook her head, backing away. I've already said I'd call you if I think of anything. Now quit bugging me. She spun away before he could say anything, hoping Tanner was still waiting for her. She was relieved to find him where they'd organized to meet. And when he didn't ask why she was late, she guessed it hadn't taken that long to talk to Jack. She had no idea what Jack was meant to help with, but doubted it had anything to do with Tanner. There was absolutely nothing wrong with him. The only problem she currently had was Jack. And not knowing who was leaving the roses. Although she was almost certain it was Tanner. There were too many coincidences for it not to be him. Pushing all her problems from her mind, she focused on what Tanner was saying, hoping she hadn't missed anything important. If she had, it was Jack's fault. Lunch was over far too quickly and she reluctantly returned to class, once again agreeing to meet Tanner after school. The rest of her classes seemed to take an excessively long time to finish. When the final bell sounded, it was all she could do not to run out to where Tanner's car was parked. She grinned when she saw he was waiting for her, leaning against his bonnet. He must have run. There was no other way he could have arrived before her, since his final classroom had been further away than hers. Feeling like someone was watching her, she looked off to her left, half expecting Jack. Instead she saw Cole, his arms crossed as he leaned against the side of a building, shadows preventing her from seeing his expression. Her footsteps slowed and she felt like going over to him and demanding that he stop staring at her all the time, but she didn't want to encourage him. Forcing herself to ignore Cole, she turned her gaze to Tanner and continued to walk towards him. He pushed away from the car as she reached him. "Do you need to go straight home?" "I'm supposed to." "So I can't convince you to have something to eat with me?" "It wouldn't take all afternoon. I was thinking fast food." Her parents wouldn't be home until much later. It'd only be her sister at home. And Leah more than owed her for all the time she'd covered for her. A smile slowly formed. "As long as I'm home by 4. That should give her plenty of time to get enough homework done to make it look like she'd been there all afternoon." Tanner grinned. "Let's go then." She hopped in the car, her smile still in place as she sent her sister a text to let her know she'd be late. Maybe the day wouldn't be so bad after all. If she could only figure out how to stop Jack from hassling her, then she wouldn't have a single problem in her life. She pushed him from her mind and turned to Tanner. All through the drive and their meal they spoke about siblings, where Tanner had lived previously and school. When it grew closer to 4 and it was time to leave, Lucy wanted to protest. But she didn't. She needed to be home well before her parents if she didn't want to risk being grounded on the weekend. That was the last thing she wanted, since she was really looking forward to going to the movies on Saturday. When they pulled up in front of her house, she reluctantly got out of Tanner's car. Eyeing Justin's car, she hoped he didn't have Dylan with him. Surely he could manage to visit without his brother. Hopefully her sister's relationship with Justin would be as short as the last two, and she wouldn't have to put up with Dylan much longer. Tanner got out of the car and joined her on the footpath. "I'll see you at school tomorrow." He hesitated. "Unless you want a lift in the morning?" She wished she could say yes, but didn't think her parents would agree. She shook her head. "My sister drops me off on her way to uni each morning." She started to explain that her sister dropped her at the beginning of the street leading to school, so she didn't have to go out of her way, but managed to stop the urge to babble nervously. "If you change your mind, ring me." He stepped closer. "Okay." She tilted her head to meet his blue eyes. They were a much darker blue than hers. He took the last step separating them, one hand resting low on her back, the other at the nape of her neck. He stared down at her for several seconds before his lips met hers. Lucy wrapped her arms around him, her eyes closing as she returned his kiss. When it ended, she wanted to protest and drag him back to her. As much as she didn't want to, she needed to get inside and start her homework before her parents arrived home. Tanner grinned at her. "You sure you don't need a lift in the morning?" Lucy laughed softly. "Positive. I'll see you at school." She leaned forward and gave him one last kiss before she pulled away from him, running through the open gate to her front door. When she reached it, she looked back at him. He stood there watching her. Waving, he sauntered around to the driver's door, pausing to look over the roof of the car at her before he hopped in and drove off. She almost didn't notice the rosebud on the patio near the wall. She had the door half open before she thought to check. Picking it up, she headed inside and nearly groaned when she found Dylan standing there staring at her. She had no idea what to say to him. All she wanted to do was escape to her room and do her homework. And probably reminisce about the kiss. Except she couldn't because Dylan was blocking her way. After discarding several comments and finally deciding to push past him, he spoke. "I thought he wasn't your boyfriend. You said he was only a friend." She shrugged. "Things change." "So he's your boyfriend now?" Not quite certain of the answer to that question, she shrugged again. "I need to go to my room." Dylan remained in the way, staring at her. Can I get past?" When he didn't move straight away, she started to ask him again. "Why?" She frowned. Hadn't she already told him that? "I need to go to my room." He shook his head. "No, why are you with him?" She was seriously tempted to say, "None of your business." Surely Leah would understand. Even she didn't put up with people questioning her. But she'd warned her numerous times to be nice to Dylan. That Justin was protective of his brother. Is it because he has a car? What? His comment didn't make the slightest bit of sense to her. Is he your boyfriend because he has a car? When she didn't answer immediately, Dylan spoke again. I had a girl tell me late last year that she never went out with any guy that didn't have a car. She shook her head. No. A car isn't important. There's always buses if I want to go somewhere that isn't in walking distance. She wondered if the girl had been trying to find a polite way to say no. I like him. Very much. But that certainly wasn't any of his business. Dylan stared at her a moment longer before he stepped to the side so she could walk past. She hurried to her room, not even looking back to see if he still watched her. She'd rather not know. Closing her door, she locked it and put the rose in the vase before she dropped onto her bed. She should probably start her homework, but she'd much rather remember the kiss. She couldn't resist smiling. Even seeing Dylan as soon as she'd entered the house hadn't ruined the moment. She couldn't wait to go to the movies with Tanner Saturday night. Maybe by then she'd have worked up the courage to ask him if he was the one leaving roses for her. Although she doubted it. More than likely it'd take her a couple of weeks before she could convince herself to ask him.